Okay, so I'm going to get us kicked off here. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Business Support Series webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Mann. I'm the sponsorship specialist with the Halifax Chamber and your host today. One of the Chamber's pillars of our strategic plan is retaining youth in Halifax. Our universities and quality of life do a great job of attracting them here, but we want them to stay after they graduate and build their careers and their lives in Halifax. While our retention numbers have certainly shot up in the last few years, it's up to our employers to keep them increasing. Today's speaker will help us update our hiring practices to better tap into diverse young talent pool to ultimately help boost your organization's performance. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions for our presenter. We will get to them in the Q&A section of the webinar, but please feel free to type any questions that you have in the chat box below. Our presenter and guest speaker today is Tamara Balan, a Chief Operating Officer at CivicAction, a nonprofit city building organization. Over her career, Tamara has focused on diversity in leadership, access to quality childcare, and employer-led actions that level the playing field of opportunity for youth in Canada. She has helped build coalitions of civic leaders in business, government, academia, and the community sectors. So welcome, Tamara, and I'll pass it along to you.
Thank you very much, Chris and Sandra, and to the Halifax Chamber. Really appreciate you having us this morning, and thank you to all of you who've tuned in to learn more and engage more in the topic of making your entry-level hiring more inclusive. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes introducing you to a suite of tools that we've worked with employers, academics to create here in Canada called CivicAction's HireNext. It's really intended to equip employers with very practical tools and tips to help update those entry-level HR practices and to achieve the outcomes that you've described, Chris, to really help to attract and, most importantly, retain young, diverse talent. It's been pretty amazing to see what you've done in Halifax, and we've been working with several organizations, partners, and employers to try to contribute to achieving those outcomes. We're going to be talking essentially about offering someone that first incredible job experience and keeping them there longer, which I know that many employers certainly want to do once they've gotten through that hiring phase. But first, a bit about CivicAction. So as Chris mentioned, we're a nonprofit organization based in Ontario. We've got almost about 20 years of experience in bringing leaders, senior, rising, together from all sectors to try to tackle some of the crunchiest, toughest social, economic, and environmental challenges that our regions face. Several years ago, we identified the need to give young people greater support to enter the workforce, particularly for those who are in limbo, not in employment, education, or training. We saw high youth unemployment rates, and we'll talk a little bit about more recently about where we are today, but we also saw employers having trouble filling and retaining in those entry-level roles. So why were there still so many young people disconnected from the labor market? Part of the answer was in the way organizations were approaching HR. So we set out to make it easier for employers to adopt better, more inclusive practices. We've been traveling virtually across Canada over the past couple of years, and to date we've had over 600 employers take the free HireNext assessment and use that as a tool and as a platform to continue to make progress towards inclusion in their workplace. I don't need to tell you that the world has changed dramatically since we launched HireNext a couple of years ago. COVID-19 has hit businesses and young people very hard. As of August, 20% of youth aged 15 to 24 in Nova Scotia were unemployed, which was about double the general unemployment rate. A recent study also found that more than a third of small, medium-sized employers in Canada were worrying about having access to capital to get through this second wave. So we know that there is a lot of struggle and hardship and challenges that many employers are facing now, but I want to acknowledge the time that you're taking today to prepare and or achieve those hiring goals that you may have now or will in the future. There's also been a tremendous amount of focus now on what needs to happen, what employers need to do to address the systemic and structural racism that's embedded in our workplaces, a barrier that many of our young people in Canada face to landing that great first job. The data will suggest it's certainly not a level playing field out there right now. For example, Black Canadians are 1.5 times more likely to be unemployed than non-minority Canadians. And 20% of Black women are unemployed versus 10% women on average. We've seen over the past few months, many organizations make public commitments. And what we've been working to do with those employers is to turn those good intentions into tangible actions that ensure that we see a more equitable recovery in Canada. So again, I want to acknowledge your interest in the time that you're taking today. You're in a leadership role, and we appreciate the efforts you are making towards a more inclusive workplace, towards a more inclusive Nova Scotia, towards a more inclusive Canada. Today, what we really want to help you with is to save you the trouble of Google searching best practices. So I can tell you, as a CEO of a small nonprofit, sometimes we find ourselves Google searching the best practice and or duct taping our HR to best deliver what we need to do. Without those dedicated resources in our organizations, it's often hard to keep on top of and or get ahead of some of the trends. Free tools like HireNext were designed to be a bit of that GPS. Now, there's certainly many tangible, evidence-based benefits of attracting and having more youth and more diversity in your workplace. It certainly does make great business sense. The business case is there, and I gather you're here because you see it. But just to sum up some of the key benefits. Number one, certainly we see a younger workforce bring more creativity, entrepreneurial thinking, and different ways of approaching problems and or work. Number two, we see diversity of thought and diversity in the workplace yield higher growth and revenue. For example, a study found that 1% increase in diversity in the workforce actually yielded more than 2% of revenue growth. And then lastly, there are also available incentives and subsidies to support the hiring of young people. And I know we have some employment service providers with us on the webinar today who may be able to facilitate access to some of that. That really brings me to the how. And just to kind of quickly give you a bit of a sneak peek of what makes up the HireNext toolkit, we've got a number of tips and tools and recommendations embedded in an online assessment, which is free, and also broken out into a roadmap that offers very replicable worksheets, templates, and also includes case studies that we've worked with employers here in Canada to capture, to document, to share with employers to be able to pull through. The work we did to develop the HireNext toolkit was working closely with a lot of subject matter experts, with academics, with community partners who are on the front lines supporting youth in making that transition. But we also engaged youth to understand what will work and what might be preventing them from either putting their hat in the ring and or staying within the organization. If you're looking for tailored recommendations for your organization, the online tool will help to deliver that. Based on the answers you provide, you will get 3 tips to start off with, and as you make progress and implement those, you will receive new recommendations. You can choose to complete the full assessment, which looks at the full life cycle from sourcing and recruiting through to retention, or you can dive deep into one of those areas based on the challenges you may be facing. And then once you receive the recommendations, as I've mentioned earlier, they're fully loaded with templates, tools to help you integrate that. Let's start with the sourcing and recruiting. the first stage. Really, a big part of that stage is going to be your job posting, what you ask for and the language you use. Job postings are like your ad to potential candidates, a way to make your job digestible, accessible, interesting, and attractive to youth. And I want to highlight 3 important elements that we encourage employers to consider for their entry-level job posting. Let's start with the title. Title matters. Make sure that it's clear and communicates that it's an entry-level position or opportunity. Titles that aren't clear or don't necessarily suggest that they're entry-level may turn candidates off. So using terms like intern or entry-level examples will help to attract that. Number 2, communicate what a new hire will learn and what flexibility exists in the workplace. And we know that that is one of the upsides of the recent and current pandemic we're facing, is employers are thinking about embedding and adopting more flexibility. So let's start about the what you will learn. We see a lot of employers leave that out. And whether it's formal training or development or the informal skills and information that new hires will access, it's worth spelling it out and calling it out. It will help to attract those who may not yet have them and acknowledge that you're making a contribution in their development. In terms of flexible work around arrangements, also really encourage you calling those out to help widen your talent pool. You know that distance to the job is going to be or is a major barrier for young people who live in areas who aren't well serviced by transit. And so where hours are flexible or location, certainly acknowledging that will help. Number 3, right-sizing your requirements. Consider reducing the focus on formal education. And we're increasingly seeing employers do that in Canada, but not certainly a whole lot yet. So things like highlighting non-formal training. It may be that you're open to online learning that they've done or boot camps that they've done, and de-emphasizing the post-secondary credentials that historically we've seen appear in a lot of job postings. The next item related to the education to skills shift is really in calling out the transferable skills that you're looking for that young people may have gained through their school, community work, or just personal lived experiences. I'm going to share a real life example of how a company called Fixed Software has made their job posting more inclusive. And I want to highlight specifically a note that they include, and we see other employers include, that encourages candidates who may feel they're a close fit but not an exact fit to apply. This could make the difference between someone throwing their hat in the ring or self-selecting out. And we know a lot of young people will self-select out if they do not meet all the requirements. So indicating something along the lines of, if your experience is close to, but doesn't exactly match the requirements, we still encourage you to apply. It can be very effective. As a result of a number of small changes that the company Fixed made, they have seen over the last 3 years an increased representation of youth from 48% to 60%. And in terms of retention, they've seen a growth of from 30% to 73% in 3 years. So it is those little changes that can go a very long way. So now you've got the mix of applicants. How do you screen those candidates and decide who gets considered and or gets the job? We are seeing increasingly interesting ways to screen and select. And I want to show, I will show you an example of an employer that we worked with to develop a case study. But first, many employers still use traditional formats like a resume and cover letter. We've been doing it, we continue to do that. For a young person with limited work experience, it's really hard to communicate their potential capabilities and the contributions that they can make in that way. So by using traditional methods, we are seeing employers weed out many youth who may not shine through a conventional hiring process. These processes also are not great predictors of high performance in a candidate. So what can you do about that? Consider finding ways to simulate some of the tasks that employers would actually be doing on the job. Now, I know that requires upfront planning and work to set up those simulations or scenarios, and those can certainly be woven through an interview. But increasingly, we want to encourage employers to actually invite candidates to a task-oriented simulation that will allow candidates to demonstrate their capabilities. And so now I'm going to ask my colleague Tamsin to share a video of a retailer that went and took this approach. Tamsin, I think we don't hear the audio, do we? Am I the only one?
Yeah, no, I can't hear it either.
Okie dokie. So why don't I attempt at speaking, unless, I mean, Tamsin, you can try to troubleshoot the audio. But in essence, I mean, there are lots of entry-level roles in which candidates will perform a series of different tasks. So working with H&M in this case, we did a couple of things through the case study. The first is we worked with, or rather H&M, worked to develop a preview of the job. Working closely with employment service providers, they introduced themselves as an employer to try to attract candidates in the first place. Once they attracted a wider pool of candidates, they then brought them into a store, had managers observe them performing 3 job-related tasks. And at the end of those simulations, managers offered candidates, their top performers, the job. I think it is, an example of the kind of different approach or creative approach to actually be able to see not only how they perform the task, but how they receive instruction, how they may or may not, respond to feedback, which can all be integrated into a simulation like that. The incredible thing it also offers employers to do is, in the event that you're not in a position to offer all the candidates the position, or those that just didn't perform as well, it does give employers an opportunity to share that feedback to help young people get better prepared for that next opportunity. And again, we know that it's an added investment of time. But if you're in a position to do that, it certainly goes a long way in supporting the development and job readiness of youth. But I think it also builds potentially a really great impression from a potential customer. Now, I don't know if we're able to get the audio working. Doesn't matter. These videos are all available through the HireNext assessment and the toolkit. And I think for those of you who are in a customer-facing industry and or maybe in retail, this may be something that you might be interested in checking out, and we'll be sure to provide you with links to that. All right, let's move into the onboarding and retention. So you found your new hire. My goodness, you want to make it stick, right? You might be surprised to know that 4% of new hires will leave a job after a disastrous first day. And we have heard, certainly from our young people and from managers hiring them, anecdotes of where that's happened, and frankly, where it could have been mitigated through some very simple strategies. 22% of turnover actually occurs within the first 45 days. So there is more that we could be doing to better onboard and then certainly to retain those entry-level hires. I'm going to ask another poll. There we go. There it goes. Live poll. So what strategies does your organization currently use to onboard and retain new hires? And I'm going to ask whoever can see the results. As a panelist, I'm not able to, but whoever can see the results to actually share what the outcome of the poll was.
So I can see the results coming in. Check-in before day one is in the lead right now with 3 votes. Training for both managers and youth is second. Mentorship programs is about third. And there's one answer that says none of the above.
Okay.
So checking in before day one is our winner.
Amazing. Okay. No, it's great to know. So, I mean, all that to say, I think, we are seeing employers, we'll do something. The question is, what more can we do? How can the onboarding process be augmented and improved to specifically help to support those who may not have as much work experience, any work experience, and certainly may not in the kind of role that they've been hired for. So that's excellent to see. Let's talk a little bit about the onboarding and retention. So look, mentorship and sponsorship, which we know is where there's perhaps less work being done. We, have found ourselves in that situation as a small organization. It can, however, be a great way to retain, obviously, diverse candidates once you've hired them. And I want to speak a little bit, highlight that piece specifically, because it sounds like that's where the growth opportunity is. It can be a heavy lift. It can also be a bit of a lighter touch. But all that to say about why it matters, I just want to highlight a couple of facts that we've recently found. So for example, we see Black employees in Canada often facing the systemic barriers that I've mentioned earlier. Data suggests that 65% of Black professionals feel it's harder for Black professionals to advance, and only 16% of white employees agree. So we do see a bit of a misalignment and disconnect in terms of the perceived advancement opportunities and the hurdles that certain employees may face. In Canada, so I just want to sort of set the context. In Canada, we've about 11% of employers have established a formal sponsorship program. Now we know mentorship, sponsorship, different, but all that to say about 10%, 1 in 10 employers have a sponsorship program. Meanwhile, Black employees are 5 times more likely than white employees to describe sponsorship as the most effective. So as we do the work to dismantle and address some of the systemic and structural barriers, I want to highlight the value and the potential impact of augmenting the mentoring and sponsorship opportunities. Where does that start, or what does that look like? To begin with, it may be in arranging or matching a new hire with an onboarding buddy. And you may already be doing that. And for those of you that aren't, I invite you to consider someone who the new hire isn't reporting directly to, but rather a person that can help to invest in their getting to know, getting settled into the role, and then over time, really supporting them in the more informal coaching and development and understanding and how to optimize their performance on a team with their direct manager. So that's an example that we are seeing, employers start to adopt. And I'd say begin with the onboarding, but certainly continue to examine where that can be evolved and perhaps made into something a bit more structured, working closely with the teams that you have. So one thing that I also want to highlight is we are seeing employers tap, if they have employment resource groups, working closely with those employee resource groups to design these interventions, to design these better approaches. And where that doesn't exist, to just engage team members who might have the lived experience to help to advise and build some of these new approaches. In closing, hiring diverse young people isn't just the right thing to do. And I think, again, I know that I'm speaking to the choir here. It's really great for business. And we know that currently there's untapped potential that will remain there unless we see employers continue to audit their practices and continue to update, modernize the way in which they're reaching perhaps candidates they wouldn't have reached earlier, and or engaging with the teams that they currently have to see those trajectories improve once they're in the workplace. Just to sum it up, my goodness, we've seen young people contribute to approaching problems in a whole new way, really fresh thinking, certainly an openness to new technology, an appreciation for collaboration, and frankly, a real true resilience through the lived experiences that they may have encountered in the past and that they're currently encountering. I want to acknowledge and thank our funding partners that help us to deliver presentations and have helped to build the HireNext toolkit. I also want to thank the Halifax Chamber once again for having us. It may be too early, the tongue is tied, but I want to thank Chris and Sandra and my colleague Tamsin for their help to prepare for this today. And now I believe we've got time for some Q&A, and Chris will come back to help moderate that.
Yeah, thanks, Tamara. Great job, great presentation. Interesting stuff. It's funny when you were talking about that example of a company with the exact fit in terms of youth today seem to be deselecting themselves based on the verbiage that's there. And to be honest, I find that may not be just a youth thing. I find a lot of people are doing that now. It's very black and white. People don't read into the gray and they just say, oh, well, I don't have that, so I'm honestly not an ideal candidate. So I love that example. I think that's great for corporations to use going forward for hiring. So I encourage anyone to put in a question in the Q&A box below, but I do have a number of questions here that we have collected. So Tamara, I'm going to put my W5 investigating, reporting hat on, my 60 minutes. I've done a lot of research on this to ask you some good hard questions, so get ready for these, okay? So just to kind of get straight to the punch, why are businesses not hiring young people? Why is that? Why do you think?
I mean, I would say two reasons, and we surveyed employers before we got started on HireNext, right? We sort of wanted to go in understanding what are those challenges. I'd say two big challenges. One is there's certainly some misconceptions and myths and perceptions about young people's capability. We hear things about work ethic. So we had some myth busting to do. And secondly, and I can talk a little bit more about that, but secondly, it was also a question of how best to do that. So I think we default to what we're already doing as opposed to trying new approaches that would attract youth. And secondly, the challenge of finding the right community partner or referral partner has often been a hurdle to try to cast the net wider. So it's a little bit of a, I'm not sure we want young people in the kind of competitive labor market that we've seen. But secondly, really about how do we reach a hard to reach fragmented candidate pool, and knowing the approaches and the partners to work with has been a big challenge.
Okay, great. So that kind of lends into the next question too, because, and this always seemed to be the case when I was out of university looking for jobs, that typically young people are asking for extensive experience, or the employers are looking for that for an entry-level position. How do we break that kind of practice for business organizations to get away from that? Because they have to build experience somewhere.
You got it. I mean, we see a huge and kind of inflation of requirements and credentials, and that truly is a really big opportunity for Canadian employers. We've seen some eliminate degrees and diplomas as a requirement. Few, but some. Right. And big employers who've said, you know what, they're not great predictors. So we're going to find different ways. We're going to get really clear about the skills we want those young people to bring, as opposed to an educational credential. So I think, as I'd mentioned earlier, there is upfront work that's required to set things up, but once you do, you'll see better results. So I would say, really getting clear about the skill set, and then being open to young people presenting it from their lived experiences, from their school, it may be that it's, you know, not post-secondary, but before post-secondary school experience or community work. So I think it's really a shift to skills versus credentials. And then the other opportunity is thinking about the character traits. We haven't seen as much of character traits emphasized, but when you get clear about the skills and the character traits and find different ways to test for those, and of course there are tools out there, and we're not sort of, you know, latching onto any specific tool, you can use those to objectively assess for skills or character traits. But I think it's also in how you approach the screening and selection and just moving away from the old ways.
Right. Yeah, no, and that's great points. And I think, you know, to your point in your presentation about having the onboarding buddy, I mean, that's a great idea to have that. And when you think about it, a lot of youth are coming in, they're sponges, right? They'll look at everything that you're giving them and they'll absorb it. Whereas if you hire someone with that extensive experience, sometimes you're hiring someone that it's difficult to break that mold, and they're going to go back to their normal way of doing things. Or you could have some youth that are saying, you know, why don't we try it this way and do it different, right? So that's some great points on that. So you talked a lot about in your presentation about diversity, and that's something that we really want to open our doors here at the Chamber, but also along or across Canada, or Nova Scotia, I should say, in Halifax. So our company has talked a lot about changing our hiring practices and becoming more diverse, but nothing really seems to change when it comes to that. People can always talk about diversity and changing towards it. So what are some key elements making this kind of transition stick, would you say?
Yeah, well, the evidence is there to say that when you have a hiring manager that is from a diverse community or an underrepresented group that's interviewing candidates, they're more likely to hire. And I think that's part of the problem. You're trying to diversify without the diversity already in place. So one is where it does exist in the team. And again, I'm going to talk about it as a small employer, where we have members of our team that identify as underrepresented groups in generally the labor market or labor force, frankly, and certainly in our own organization, we might engage them in an interview. We might say, you know what, would you join us for this next role? They might not, and we've seen some, you know, certainly they may have a different perspective. So where diversity might already exist in the organization, find ways to either tap their insights and perspectives on the process to make sure that you're more aware of, frankly, some of those barriers and or systemic discrimination that may be embedded, and where possible, engage them in the screening and selection process.
Okay. So when you think about diversity, a lot of organizations always seem to hire internally because it's something that they believe in your core values. They've been there. It's an easy transition. They know. And sometimes when you do that, it's not really extending diversity in your business because you're hiring the same people that you hired at the forefront. So how do businesses then kind of, or what's your recommendation on how businesses can avoid to do that from the forefront? Like, how do you get it that, okay, you can change your practices at the forefront, but sometimes if you're hiring internally, you're never going to kind of change that routine?
Totally. I think it's about finding some really strong referral partners.
Okay.
And I'm going to give a shout out to the employment service providers on the webinar, but I also know, I mean, Halifax and Nova Scotia, you have several employment service providers on the front lines, helping young people to prepare for jobs. Not all are made equal, and not all will understand a sector or industry in the same way. So again, it's that little bit of upfront work to engage and or connect with possible referral partners to determine which one will be the best fit. The HireNext toolkit actually has, guides on how to assess and or build some of those relationships with community partners so that they can send you candidates that will be, great candidates and potentially great new team members.
Great. So we do have a question that just popped up from one of our panelists or our participants here. So I'll just read through that. So how does the requirement for immigrants impact the youth labor pool?
Well, great question. I'd say, you know, when we looked at the data of what young people are underrepresented, three key groups stood out. One is racialized youth, two is newcomer youth, and three are youth from Indigenous communities. And so I'd say, you know, how does it affect it? It's true. We're seeing cases where employers are hiring adults, I mean, they're all adults, but older adults versus younger adults. That said, the change, I mean, within the newcomer pool, there are many young people. And so I think we are seeing some displacement of where young people would have perhaps had that first job opportunity, no longer there. But that's why we're doing this work to say, you know, make your hiring more inclusive, make sure that it's you're considering a younger labor pool. And I think the points around skill sets and character traits versus credentials and years of work experience help to broaden that horizon.
Perfect. So we have another question from our participant here. Hi, Tamara. How long does it take for an employer to complete the assessment on average?
Okay. Great question. I should have said that in the presentation, so thank you. It takes in and around, say, as little as 10 minutes and as many as 20. So it's broken up into the 3 modules. And if someone just does one module, it may be just 10, 15 minutes, which delivers 3 tailored recommendations. And I think that's really important. And again, I've done the Google searching, I've done the duct taping of HR to try to keep up and or get ahead of some of the practices. This here helps to prioritize them. It gives everyone a starting point based on where they're at already in their inclusion journey. So there's a little bit of an employer profile that's captured, followed by a deeper dive into one of those modules.
So here at the Chamber, we have a wonderful president and CEO who always has the ear of all levels of government. What can we do to kind of, you know, what role can we kind of promote for governments to encourage this type of hiring behavior in all the levels that you're talking about?
I mean, I think I'd say 2 key things I would say to government. Be that role model employer. So do the audit, adopt the best practices, where possible at the entry level, hire young people. So I would say that's a huge role. And frankly, sometimes we're seeing the private sector, you know, move more quickly than the public sector. So do the work internally. Number 2, as governments invest in that employment readiness and support and training, think about the employers. It's that looking at both sides of the coin. One is continue to invest in young people and the training and development, but also look at ways to make it easier for employers. So promote best practices. You know, shameless plug for the HireNext tool. Encourage employers that are accessing subsidies or incentives to do the work internally. Because if those conditions and processes don't change, we might see attrition rates we don't want to see. And government's already making such a huge investment. So I'd say keep the dual kind of client approach and be really mindful of ways to make it easier for employers to establish more inclusive workplaces.
Okay, great. So outside of like the programs you mentioned, is there anything else that organizations could do to keep the financial commitment a little bit lower when looking at doing any of this hiring?
I think in terms of talking about the recruiting piece, right? The sourcing and recruiting. So I think it's really effective in working with a community partner. There's also, I mean, through social media, some really cost-effective ways to promote opportunities. And so I gather most employers aren't just posting their openings on the website, although some still predominantly that's sort of their channel. And if young people don't know about you or don't think you're a you know, a youth inclusive workplace, they may not think to go to that career page. So using social media to promote opportunities, but also build a bit of a brand. And that's, again, leveraging your the existing talent you have in the workplace can be super effective. So making use of things like LinkedIn or Twitter, your current employees can really help to get the message out, to help to achieve that, you know, bigger goal of Halifax and or that specific enterprise is a great place to work. And it's a great city to stay in. And so I think it's thinking creatively, back to the point around one of the benefits. They're on social media, they use social media. Is there a way to tap and engage some of them in promoting the workplace that they're in?
Yeah, those are great points. And you kind of wish, from an employer point of view, that all your employees are brand ambassadors, if you will, right? That they're going to be promoting you. And yeah, no, that's a great point. So we do have a couple more questions here. You're doing okay? I'm hammering you questions. You're all right? Okay, perfect. So a couple more from our participants. How is youth hiring impacted in rural communities versus urban?
That's a great question, Chris, and I'd love to be able to answer that. I'd say, you know, we are based in Ontario. Our focus has been primarily on urban regions and the dynamics, the socioeconomic dynamics in urban. We're very mindful, but I couldn't give a great answer to that question. I can only speak to anecdotally, you know, some of what we're seeing in certainly Ontario and in the agricultural sector as an example. But I'd say great question, and whoever's asked it, we can do a little bit of research and come back to you.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, great. No, that's perfect. And one thing I wrote down, I should mention too, even with the video too, we can share any information that you like with all of the participants. So we can include that as a follow-up email too. So I should have mentioned that. One more question here as well. What can hiring departments do to avoid quitting jobs from a new hire? So maybe someone that comes in and quits a job and moves on to the next one, maybe job jumping a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think we tried to sort of just pick out a few tips. There is a whole chapter on retention and onboarding. And I think, you know, we asked the question of how many employers are sending information ahead of day one. I mean, again, I'm probably speaking to those of you who know this better than I do, but it's months of checkpoints, check-ins, some very light touch ways to facilitate the settling in and then the retention piece. And I'll share an anecdote a bit about that sort of disastrous first date example. What we find, you know, young people probably need as much or more than anything is just understanding how best to communicate with their manager, knowing that there is a receptive ear in the manager. And we heard a retailer share, you know, this example, which said, you know, we had that, we were that data point. We were that young person shows up to work on the first day, gets their schedule for the week, and discovers that they can't make that time because public transit isn't going to run, and they didn't feel confident enough to have that conversation. So there's just a no-show. So they leave the job. I mean, it's a pretty extreme example, but I think it speaks to the value of establishing great lines of communication, being probably really explicit about it. Maybe it feels like a little bit of overcompensating, but I think we do see a bit of a confidence gap, certainly among some entry-level employees, to speak up when things aren't going to be that effective or work as well. And so there's, you know, communication alone will mitigate for some of that.
Okay, great. And this question comes from me, just a personal question in a sense of, is there anything that universities or, you know, colleges, high schools can do to better prepare youth for employment, in your opinion?
That's a great question. So when we surveyed youth, you know what was interesting is in spite of all this information that's out there, and like every second there's more information than there ever was out there, right? We heard young people, kind of 4 key barriers, but the number 1 barrier was the information gap. We don't know who's hiring. We're not really clear about the expectations. We don't really know where to get that information. So certainly some employers and or opportunities they'll be aware of, but they're absolutely unaware of the broad range of opportunities. And I think post-secondary institutions working closely with a very diverse pool of employers can help to shed light on where those first jobs are at. The point around expectations, again, employers can do it on their own through the job posting to say, here are the skills we're looking for. Here's what we're willing to teach you, right? You're going to learn some things on the job. But I actually think it's in the work that post-secondary and employers can do together to try to direct young people to where the information may exist and or to encourage to build the skill set to navigate an increasingly online job market.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, I know high schools personally probably have evolved from when I was in high school, but I felt like there was a lot of great things I learned in high school, but I wish there was a lot of things concentrating on getting my first job. Because there's some people that are just, they're focused, they know what they want to do, but there's a lot of people that don't. And, you can go into trades, you can go into a certain profession, but sometimes you just don't know. And there's got to be something to build those skill sets in school to get you ready to get out in those jobs. And vice versa. I think it's a great point to have employers reaching out to these institutions to get involved, to be like, these are the things that we're looking for. And these are the things that we want to do to hire youth. And this is something that you could help implement into your programs. So, Tamara, I think that's it. I think we've exhausted our questions here, and thank you to our panelists that have offered their questions as well. Some really good insights from you, Tamara. So thanks so much. Really appreciate it. But yeah, so we'll end it there. But thank you again, and I'll just say some closing remark here. So thank you to everyone again for attending today's webinar, and thank you, Tamara and Hampson, for your time today. Join us again tomorrow to learn how you as a chamber member can take advantage of the SimplyCast communications and management platform for free. This webinar today was recorded and will be available to all our attendees shortly on our YouTube channel. So I advise you to check that out if you can. And I hope everyone has a great end of their day and a great end to their week. Thanks so much.